He thought denying her would protect the stage, but he had no idea he was about to witness the moment that would redefine everything he believed about greatness. The grand concert hall shimmered beneath cascading crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off polished marble floors that echoed with the quiet confidence of wealth and prestige. And at the center of it all stood Daniel Harrington, the man who decided who belonged and who did not, his tailored tuxedo sharp, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning every movement with practiced authority, because tonight was not just another performance. It was a statement of excellence reserved only for the elite, only for those who had earned their place through years of recognition, reputation, and refinement. And in his world there was no room for mistakes, no space for the unexpected, certainly no tolerance for disruption, especially not from someone who didn't fit the image. And yet just beyond the heavy velvet doors, standing quietly in the soft glow of the evening lights, was Sister Margaret Whitmore, her worn gray habit gently brushing against the floor, her hands folded calmly in front of her presence so unassuming it almost seemed invisible, as though she belonged to a different world entirely, one far removed from the grandeur inside, a world where silence carried more meaning than applause, where devotion replaced ambition, and where the sound of a piano was not a performance, but a prayer. And for a moment she simply stood there, observing the building, her eyes steady, not with hesitation, but with something deeper, something that suggested memory, as if the walls before her were not unfamiliar, but forgotten, like a melody waiting to be recalled. Inside the hall musicians moved with urgency, tuning instruments, adjusting sheet music, whispering in hushed tones about the importance of the night, their voices blending into a soft hum of anticipation. While Daniel paced near the stage, reviewing the final lineup, his assistant trailing closely behind, clipboard in hand, reminding him of timings, sponsors, and the distinguished guests seated in the front rows. Every detail mattered, every second calculated, because excellence, in his mind, was not something discovered. It was something controlled, curated, and protected. And then the doors opened, just slightly, barely enough to draw attention, and Sister Margaret stepped inside, her shoes making the faintest sound against the marble, a contrast so stark it caused a subtle shift in the air. Conversation slowed, glances turned, not out of curiosity, but quiet judgment, the kind that forms instantly, the kind that decides worth without a single word. She walked slowly, deliberately, not searching, not rushing, simply moving forward with a calm that seemed almost out of place in a room built on pressure and performance. Her eyes briefly resting on the grand piano at the center of the stage, a Steinway polished to perfection, its surface gleaming under the lights like a symbol of everything this hall represented. And for just a second, something flickered across her face. Not longing, not admiration, but recognition, as though she was looking at an old companion rather than an untouchable instrument. Daniel noticed her then. Of course he did. Nothing escaped his attention. His gaze narrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in calculation, assessing, categorizing, dismissing, because in a place like this, people were expected to belong before they even spoke, and she clearly did not by his standards, not by anyone's standards here. And yet she continued forward, step by quiet step, until she stood just within the edge of the stage light, her presence small against the vastness of the hall, but somehow impossible to ignore. And though no one said it out loud, the question lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. What was she doing here, and why did it feel, even in that moment, as if the night was no longer unfolding according to plan, as if something unseen had already begun to shift beneath the surface, something Daniel Harrington could not control, and something he was not prepared to face. And in that fragile silence, before a single note had been played, the room itself seemed to hold its breath. Daniel Harrington's gaze lingered on Sister Margaret longer than it should have, not because she posed any real threat, but because something about her calm refusal to shrink under the weight of the room unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain, and that alone was enough to irritate him. Because in his world uncertainty was weakness and perception was everything. So he stepped forward with measured precision, each polished shoe striking the marble with quiet authority as the surrounding conversations dissolved into silence. his presence commanding attention without effort. And when he finally stopped a few feet from her, the contrast between them became impossible to ignore, his tailored perfection against her modest simplicity, his sharp control against her quiet stillness. And for a brief moment neither of them spoke, but the room already knew what was coming, because it had seen this dynamic play out countless times before, the powerful correcting the misplaced, the gatekeeper restoring order. And when Daniel finally spoke, his voice carried just enough politeness to mask the dismissal beneath it, asking if she needed assistance in the same tone one might use for someone clearly out of place. But Sister Margaret did not flinch, did not rush to explain herself. She simply met his gaze with a steadiness that felt almost disarming, as though she had nothing to prove and nothing to fear. And when she answered, her voice was soft but clear, requesting permission to play the piano, just a few minutes. Nothing more, a simple request that should have been easy to refuse. And yet something about the way she said it lingered in the air longer than expected, as if the words themselves carried weight beyond their meaning. But Daniel recovered quickly, his expression tightening ever so slightly as a faint ripple of amusement passed through a few nearby musicians who had begun to gather, their curiosity sharpened by the unfolding exchange, because to them the idea was almost absurd. This elderly nun standing beneath the lights of a stage reserved for internationally recognized performers, asking to touch an instrument that had been prepared for a carefully curated evening, and Daniel allowed himself a small, controlled smile, the kind that suggested patience rather than kindness, as he explained that the instrument was reserved for scheduled artists only, that the evening had been meticulously planned, that every performance had been vetted and approved, each word reinforcing the invisible barrier she had already crossed simply by asking. But Sister Margaret did not retreat. She did not apologize or lower her gaze. Instead, she nodded gently, as if she had expected the answer. And for a moment it seemed the interaction might end there, quietly, without incident, until one of the younger musicians, emboldened by the growing audience, let out a soft chuckle that broke the fragile tension, followed by another whisper, and then another, until the room began to hum again with that subtle, familiar energy of judgment, not loud enough to be called cruel, but sharp enough to be felt. And Daniel, sensing the shift, straightened slightly, aware that this was no longer just a private interaction. This was a moment being observed, evaluated, remembered, and he could not afford ambiguity. So his tone sharpened just enough to close the door completely, stating clearly that this was not an open space for experimentation, that the integrity of the event had to be maintained, and that perhaps she would be more comfortable elsewhere. The words delivered with a finality that left little room for interpretation, and still, she did not move, her eyes drifting once more toward the piano, not with defiance, but with a quiet patience that seemed to stretch the moment longer than it should have, as if time itself hesitated around her. And somewhere near the back of the stage, an older violinist paused mid-conversation, his brow furrowing slightly as he studied her face, a flicker of recognition crossing his features before quickly fading, as though he had almost remembered something important but could not quite grasp it. And then the sound of a phone ringing cut through the air, sharp and urgent, breaking the tension as Daniel's assistant rushed toward him with hurried steps, whispering something into his ear that caused his expression to shift, not dramatically, but enough to signal that something unexpected had just entered the carefully controlled environment, something that would soon demand his attention. And as he turned away for just a moment, distracted by whatever complication had arisen, Sister Margaret remained exactly where she was, calm, patient, waiting, as if she already understood that the night was far from over, and that the door that had just been closed so firmly was about to open in a way no one in that room was prepared for. The words from Daniel's assistant did not need to be loud to carry weight, because the moment they reached his ears, the confidence that had defined his posture just seconds ago tightened into something far more controlled, far more cautious, and the subtle shift did not go unnoticed by those closest to him, especially the seasoned musicians who had learned to read tension the way others read sheet music. And within seconds the quiet hum of the hall changed tone, no longer filled with casual judgment, but with curiosity edged in uncertainty, as Daniel stepped aside, lowering his voice as he spoke rapidly with his assistant, his eyes flicking once toward the stage, then toward the entrance, then back again, calculating, adjusting, because whatever had just happened was not part of the plan, and in a place built entirely on precision, even a small disruption could unravel everything. Meanwhile, Sister Margaret remained still, her presence almost paradoxical in the growing tension, as if she existed outside the urgency that now gripped the room, her hands resting lightly together, her gaze neither demanding nor retreating, simply waiting. And it was that stillness that began to draw attention in a different way, not as an intrusion, but as something quietly persistent, something that refused to disappear just because it was inconvenient. And near the edge of the stage, the older violinist who had noticed her earlier took a step closer, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her face more carefully, searching through memory that felt just out of reach, like a melody half remembered. And then he shook his head subtly, dismissing the thought, because the idea forming in his mind felt impossible, and yet it lingered, refusing to fully fade. Across the room, a stage manager hurried forward, whispering urgently to Daniel, whose jaw tightened as he listened. The words not fully audible, but the meaning unmistakable. The lead pianist, the centerpiece of the entire evening, was not going to make it, delayed, unreachable, or worse. And suddenly the carefully constructed program that had taken months to perfect stood on the edge of collapse. Because without that performance the night would lose its momentum, its prestige, its promise to the audience seated just beyond the curtains, donors, critics, and influential figures who did not tolerate disappointment. And Daniel knew it. He felt it in the tightening of his chest, in the quickening rhythm of his thoughts as he weighed options that did not exist, replacements that were not prepared, adjustments that would expose the flaw in the system he had worked so hard to control. And for the first time that evening, his certainty wavered, just slightly, just enough to create a crack in the flawless surface he presented to the world. And it was in that moment, that fragile, uncertain pause, that someone near the back spoke quietly, almost hesitantly, suggesting something that at first seemed absurd, so quiet it almost did not register, until it did. And when it did, it spread through the immediate circle like a ripple, drawing glances, raised brows, silent exchanges, because the suggestion was simple, almost too simple. The woman who had just asked to play was still standing there, still, waiting, and the thought of it hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable, a possibility that challenged everything the room believed about itself, about standards, about appearances, about who was allowed to step into that light. And Daniel heard it too. Of course he did. And for a moment his expression hardened in reflex, rejecting the idea before it could fully form, because it went against everything he represented, everything he had built. But the reality pressed in around him, the absence of alternatives, the growing pressure, the eyes that would soon be watching, expecting, judging, and slowly, reluctantly, his gaze shifted back towards Sister Margaret, who had not moved, who had not insisted, who had not even reacted to the unfolding chaos. She simply stood there as if she had always been part of this moment, as if she had been waiting not for permission, but for time itself to catch up. And in that quiet, suspended instant, the balance of the night began to tilt, not dramatically, not yet, but enough that those paying close attention could feel it, the subtle shift from certainty to possibility, from control to risk. And though no decision had been spoken aloud, something unspoken had already begun to change, and deep down, beyond the layers of control and expectation, Daniel felt it, the unsettling realization that the very person he had dismissed might now be the only one standing between him and failure. And the room, once filled with quiet judgment, now held a different kind of silence, one that carried anticipation, doubt, and the faintest trace of something no one was ready to admit: hope. Daniel Harrington did not respond immediately, and that hesitation alone was enough to shift the entire energy of the room, because a man who never hesitated was now standing at the edge of a decision he could not fully control, his mind racing through consequences, reputations, the silent expectations of the audience seated just beyond the velvet curtain, and the fragile structure of prestige he had spent years building, all of it now resting on a choice that felt both absurd and unavoidable. And as he looked at Sister Margaret again, truly looked this time, something in her stillness began to unsettle him in a way that logic could not explain, because she was not pleading, Not nervous, not even hopeful in the way most people would be in her position. She was simply present, grounded in a quiet certainty that did not ask for validation, and that made her far more difficult to dismiss. Around them, the musicians had grown silent, their earlier amusement replaced by cautious curiosity. Because the situation had evolved beyond simple judgment into something far more delicate, a moment that would define how this night would be remembered, and perhaps more importantly, how Daniel himself would be judged by those who mattered most: the donors, the critics, the unseen voices of influence that shaped careers with a single opinion. And the pressure tightened around him like an invisible vice, forcing his hand toward a decision he would have rejected without a second thought just minutes ago. And finally, with a measured breath, he stepped forward again, his voice controlled, but no longer dismissive, as he addressed her directly, asking if she truly believed she could perform at the level required for this stage. The question carrying both skepticism and an unspoken challenge, as though daring her to falter, to reveal herself as unqualified so that he could reclaim control of the narrative. But Sister Margaret did not rush to answer. She did not defend herself or make bold claims. Instead, she simply nodded once, a small, quiet gesture that carried an unexpected weight, because it was not confidence born from ego, but something deeper, something that suggested experience rather than ambition. And for a moment, the two stood in silence again, the air thick with unspoken tension, until Daniel turned slightly toward his assistant, issuing a series of rapid instructions, adjusting the program, shifting the order, buying time in the only way he could, because even as he made the decision, he was already preparing for the possibility of failure, the need to contain it, to minimize the damage if this risk did not pay off. And then he looked back at her and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, granting permission not with enthusiasm, but with reluctant necessity. And the effect was immediate, a ripple moving through the room as whispers returned, no longer mocking, but uncertain, speculative, as if everyone present understood they were about to witness something that could not be easily undone. And slowly, deliberately, Sister Margaret stepped forward, her movement unhurried, each step carrying a quiet sense of purpose that seemed to draw the room inward, as though the space itself was adjusting around her. And when she reached the stage, the lights caught her in a soft glow, highlighting the simplicity of her presence against the grandeur of the setting. And for a brief moment, she paused beside the piano, her hand hovering just above its polished surface, not touching it yet, as if acknowledging it, as if greeting an old companion after years apart. And in that pause, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, because the room, once filled with doubt, now held something else, something quieter, something closer to anticipation. And in the back, the older violinist leaned forward slightly, his eyes widening as recognition finally began to take shape, a memory resurfacing with sudden clarity, though he said nothing, not yet, because even he was not certain he trusted what he was beginning to remember. And Daniel watched from the side, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. But inside, beneath the layers of control, something had begun to unravel, a realization forming slowly, uncomfortably, that this moment was no longer his to control, that whatever was about to happen on that stage would not follow his script. And as Sister Margaret finally lowered herself onto the bench, her hands resting gently in her lap, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath, suspended in a silence so complete it felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself had paused, waiting. And in that stillness, just before the first note, the balance of power shifted completely, though no one had yet heard a sound. For a moment, nothing happened, and that nothing stretched longer than anyone in the room expected, long enough for doubt to creep back into the edges of their thoughts, long enough for Daniel Harrington to almost convince himself that this had been a mistake he could still contain, because Sister Margaret simply sat there, her back straight, her eyes lowered gently toward the keys, her hands resting in her lap, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. And then slowly, with a calm that felt almost ceremonial, she lifted her hands and placed them on the piano. And the instant her fingers touched the keys, something shifted, not in sound, but in presence, as if the instrument itself recognized her before the audience did. And then the first note came, soft, precise, impossibly controlled, not tentative as many had expected, but deliberate, confident in a way that silenced even the faintest whisper before it could form. And that single note carried into the vast hall with a clarity that felt almost unnatural, like a voice cutting cleanly through noise. And then another note followed, and another, building not in volume, but in intention, forming a melody that seemed to unfold rather than begin, as though it had always been there waiting to be heard. And the effect was immediate. Conversations that had barely resumed fell away again. Heads turned fully now, not out of curiosity, but attention, because what they were hearing did not match what they were seeing. And that contradiction created a tension far more powerful than doubt. And as the melody grew, her hands moved with a fluid precision that could not be imitated, each motion effortless, each transition seamless, not rushed, not forced, but guided by something deeper than technique, something that spoke of years, decades even, of understanding the instrument not as an object, but as an extension of thought itself. And near the back of the stage, the older violinist felt his breath catch, his eyes widening as recognition finally settled into certainty, because he had heard this before, not in person, not like this, but in recordings spoken about in hushed reverence, performances that had once defined an era before disappearing without explanation, and now, impossibly, that same unmistakable style was unfolding in front of him, carried through the hands of a woman no one had taken seriously. Just minutes ago, and across the stage Daniel stood frozen, not visibly, not in a way that others would immediately notice, but internally, because every expectation he had constructed was being dismantled note by note, each phrase of music revealing a level of mastery he could not deny, no matter how much he wanted to, and the audience beyond the curtain, drawn in by the unexpected sound, began to quiet as well, their conversations fading as the music reached them, pulling them into a performance they had not been prepared for, and the room itself seemed to respond, the acoustics amplifying not just the sound, but the emotion behind it, filling every corner with something that could not be easily described, something that moved beyond admiration into something closer to reverence. And still she played, her expression unchanged, her focus complete, not performing for the audience, not seeking approval, but simply allowing the music to exist, pure and unfiltered. And as the tempo shifted, rising gently, then falling with controlled grace, the complexity of the piece revealed itself, layers within layers, subtle variations that only the most trained ear could fully appreciate, and yet even those without technical knowledge felt it, the weight of it, the undeniable truth that what they were witnessing was not ordinary, not even exceptional in the way they were used to defining excellence, but something rare, something that could not be manufactured or scheduled or curated. And in that moment, the hierarchy that had governed the room just minutes before dissolved completely, replaced by a silence that was no longer judgmental, but captivated. And Daniel knew it. He felt it in the stillness around him, in the way no one looked to him anymore for direction, because the control he had held so tightly had slipped away the instant her hands touched the keys, and now the only thing left to do was listen, as the woman he had nearly turned away continued to reveal, note by note, a truth he could no longer ignore. The music did not rush toward a climax. It unfolded with a patience that commanded respect, each phrase layered with intention, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate the story being told through her hands. And the longer Sister Margaret played, the clearer it became that this was not simply a performance. It was a revelation, one that stripped away assumptions with quiet precision, because what filled the hall now was not just technical brilliance, but something far more elusive, something that could not be taught or replicated, a depth of expression that carried memory, discipline, sacrifice, and a lifetime of devotion woven into every note. And the audience, those who had entered expecting a carefully curated evening of predictable excellence, now found themselves leaning forward in their seats, drawn into something they had not anticipated, something that did not ask for approval but demanded attention. And even those who did not understand the complexity of what they were hearing could feel it, the weight of it, the undeniable presence of something rare, something that transcended performance and became experience. And near the stage, the older violinist could no longer contain what he had realized, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke to the musician beside him. repeating a name that had not been heard in years, a name once spoken with reverence in the highest circles of classical music before it vanished without explanation. And as that name passed from one person to another in hushed disbelief, the realization began to spread, slow at first, then gathering certainty, because the style, the phrasing, the unmistakable control over dynamics and silence, it all pointed to something impossible, something the room was only just beginning to comprehend. And Daniel Harrington heard it too, fragments of recognition slipping through the silence between notes, and with each passing second the certainty he had once held about his own authority eroded further, replaced by a growing awareness that he had misjudged not just a person, but a presence, a history, a level of mastery that existed far beyond his carefully constructed hierarchy. And still she played, her posture unchanged, her expression serene, untouched by the shifting perception around her, as if none of it mattered, as if the music itself was the only truth she acknowledged. And when the piece began to rise again, building toward its most demanding passages, there was no hesitation, no strain, only a seamless transition into complexity that left even the most accomplished musicians in the room quietly stunned. Because what she was executing required not only flawless technique, but an intimacy with the instrument that could only come from years of dedication at the highest level. And yet she carried it with such ease that it felt almost effortless, almost natural. And that contrast between the difficulty of the piece and the simplicity of her presence created a moment so powerful that no one dared break it. And as the final sequence approached, the tempo slowed just enough to draw every ounce of attention into the last unfolding phrases, each note placed with deliberate care, each pause measured, intentional, allowing the silence between sounds to speak just as clearly as the music itself. And then, with a final movement that felt less like an ending and more like a release, her hands lifted from the keys, and the last note lingered in the air, suspended for just a fraction of a second before fading into a silence so complete it felt almost sacred. And no one moved, no one spoke, because the room had not yet caught up to what it had just experienced. And in that stillness, as the echoes of the performance settled into memory, something undeniable had taken hold, something that could not be reversed or ignored. And Daniel stood there, his breath shallow, his thoughts unsteady, facing a truth that had revealed itself not through argument or explanation, but through something far more powerful, something he had tried to control but never truly understood. And for the first time that night, the authority he carried felt smaller than the moment unfolding before him. For a long moment after the final note faded, no one moved, as if the room itself needed time to return to reality, because what had just happened did not fit into any expectation they had brought with them that evening. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, a single sound broke through the silence, a soft intake of breath from somewhere in the audience, followed by another, and then another, until the stillness gave way to something else entirely, not noise, not yet, but a collective realization forming in real time. And when the first pair of hands came together in applause, hesitant but sincere, it did not remain alone for long, because within seconds it spread across the hall, growing in intensity, rising from polite acknowledgement into something far more powerful, something that carried awe, disbelief, and an undeniable respect that could not be withheld any longer. And the sound filled the space, echoing off the marble and crystal, transforming the atmosphere completely, because this was no longer a performance being evaluated, it was a moment being honored. And at the center of it all, Sister Margaret remained seated for just a second longer, her hands resting gently above the keys, as if she were allowing the music to fully leave before she did. And then she stood, slowly, with the same quiet composure she had carried from the moment she entered, turning slightly toward the audience, offering a small, humble nod that acknowledged their response without seeking it. And that simple gesture seemed to deepen the impact even further, because there was no triumph in her expression, no desire for recognition, only a calm acceptance that what needed to be done had been done. And across the stage, Daniel Harrington felt the applause differently than anyone else, because while others heard brilliance, he heard consequence, each clap echoing with the weight of his earlier judgment. each rising wave of approval a reminder of how quickly certainty can collapse when confronted with truth. And as he stood there, unable to look away, he realized that the control he had valued so highly had not just slipped from his grasp. It had been replaced by something far more powerful, something he could neither shape nor contain. And near the back, the older violinist finally stepped forward, his hesitation gone now, his expression filled with a mixture of disbelief and quiet reverence as he approached the stage, stopping just short of stepping into the light. Because even now he seemed to recognize that what stood before him was not simply a performer, but something far greater, something that demanded a different kind of respect. And when Sister Margaret turned slightly in his direction, their eyes met for a brief moment. And in that exchange the recognition became mutual, not spoken, not announced, but understood, as if two people who had walked very different paths had finally arrived at the same point in time. And around them the murmurs began to shift, names being whispered more clearly now, questions forming, connections being made, as the realization spread beyond the musicians and into the wider audience. Because this was no longer just an unexpected performance, this was a discovery, or perhaps a rediscovery. Something thought lost now standing in plain sight. And yet through it all Sister Margaret remained unchanged, her posture steady, her presence grounded, as if the growing attention did not alter her in the slightest. And that, more than anything, began to quiet the room once again, because the applause, as powerful as it had been, could not overshadow the deeper truth settling into place, that greatness does not always arrive with recognition, and that sometimes the most extraordinary presence can stand unnoticed until the moment it chooses to reveal itself. And as the final echoes of applause softened into a respectful hush, the room found itself in a new kind of silence, one no longer filled with doubt or judgment, but with something far more lasting, something that would remain long after the night had ended. And at the center of it all stood the woman who had changed everything without ever asking for permission. The applause did not fade all at once. It dissolved slowly, like a tide pulling back from the shore, leaving behind something deeper than sound, something that lingered in the air long after the final claps softened into silence. And in that quiet, the truth began to surface in a way that no announcement could contain, because recognition was no longer confined to whispers. It had taken shape in the faces of those who knew what they had just witnessed, and among them the older violinist stepped fully into the light, his movements deliberate now, no longer hesitant, his eyes fixed on Sister Margaret with a clarity that carried both respect and disbelief. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady but unmistakably moved, addressing her not as a stranger, but as someone whose name had once carried weight far beyond the walls of this hall, a name that had defined an era before vanishing without explanation. And though he did not speak it loudly, those closest to him heard it, and that was enough, because the reaction spread instantly, like a spark catching dry air, musicians turning to one another, exchanging glances that confirmed what many had begun to suspect, that the woman standing before them was not simply talented, not simply skilled, but someone whose legacy had been hidden in plain sight, someone whose absence had once left a silence in the world of music that had never been fully explained. And now, standing quietly in a simple gray habit, she had returned without announcement, without demand, without even a hint of the recognition that would have followed her name. And Daniel Harrington felt the shift more deeply than anyone, because the realization did not just challenge his judgment, it dismantled it completely, piece by piece, as the identity of the woman he had nearly turned away began to form in his mind. And with it came the weight of understanding that the stage he had guarded so carefully had almost been denied to someone who had once defined what that very stage stood for. And as the murmurs grew into quiet conversations, the atmosphere transformed again, not into chaos, but into reverence. A collective awareness that something extraordinary had just unfolded, something that could not be replicated or planned. And through it all Sister Margaret remained composed, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, as if the recognition around her did not alter her in any way. And when the violinist finished speaking, offering a quiet acknowledgement that bordered on gratitude, she responded with nothing more than a gentle smile, a small nod that carried both humility and finality, as though she had never sought to reclaim anything, as though the past, whatever it had been, no longer defined her. Purpose, and that simple response seemed to quiet the room once more, because it shifted the focus away from who she had been and back to who she was in that moment. A woman who had stepped forward when needed, who had played not for recognition, but because the moment required it. And that realization settled deeply into those who were paying attention, especially Daniel, who now found himself standing in a space that felt entirely different from the one he had controlled just an hour earlier. Because the authority he had relied on had been replaced by something far more humbling. The understanding that greatness does not ask for permission, and that the most powerful presence in the room is often the one that does not need to prove itself. And as he finally took a step forward, his posture no longer rigid but measured with a different kind of awareness, the distance between them felt greater than it had before, not physically, but in what it represented, because he was no longer the one defining the moment. He was the one learning from it. And as the last of the whispers faded into a quiet, respectful stillness, the night reached a point of clarity that could not be undone. A realization shared silently among everyone present, that they had not just witnessed a performance, they had witnessed the quiet return of something the world had once lost, and the undeniable reminder that true brilliance does not disappear, it simply waits for the moment when it is needed most. Daniel Harrington closed the distance slowly, each step carrying a weight that had not been there before, because the authority he once wore so easily now felt like something he had to earn back in silence. Not through control, but through understanding. And when he finally stood a few feet from Sister Margaret, he did not speak immediately, not because he did not know what to say, but because for the first time in a very long time, he understood that words alone would not be enough. And the room, still wrapped in that quiet reverence, seemed to recognize the significance of the moment, because this was no longer about a performance. It was about what came after, about what a person does when confronted with a truth that reshapes everything they believed about themselves. And when Daniel finally spoke, his voice was softer than anyone in that room had ever heard it, stripped of its usual sharp precision, carrying instead a sincerity that could not be mistaken, as he acknowledged her not with titles or assumptions, but with respect, a simple recognition of what she had done, and perhaps more importantly, what he had failed to see. And though his words were measured, there was no attempt to excuse his earlier judgment, no effort to justify it, only the quiet acceptance of it. And that alone carried more weight than any apology could have, because it was honest, and Sister Margaret listened. Without interruption, her expression unchanged, her presence steady as always. And when he finished, she did not respond with correction or acknowledgement in the way he might have expected. Instead, she offered a small, almost imperceptible smile, one that carried neither pride nor resentment, but something far more grounded, a quiet understanding that did not dwell on the past, but did not ignore it either. And in that moment it became clear that whatever she had once been known for, whatever legacy had followed her before she stepped away from that world, it no longer defined her purpose, because she had already chosen something else, something quieter, something that did not require recognition to hold value. And that realization settled deeply into the room, because it reframed everything they had just witnessed, transforming it from a return of greatness into something far more meaningful, an act of presence, of stepping forward not to reclaim status, but simply because the moment called for it. And as she turned slightly, preparing to step away from the stage, the audience instinctively parted, not out of instruction, but respect, creating a path without a word being spoken. And Daniel watched her go, not with the urgency of someone trying to hold on to something, but with the stillness of someone who had just learned something that could not be undone, something that would remain long after the lights dimmed and the hall returned to its usual rhythm. And around him the conversations began again, but they were different now, quieter, more thoughtful, carrying the weight of what had just been revealed, not just about her, but about all of them, about the ease with which judgment is formed, and the cost of that assumption when it is wrong. And though the night would continue, though the program would adjust, and the audience would eventually return to the expectations they had arrived with, something fundamental had shifted beneath it all, something that could not be reversed, because once truth reveals itself in such a way, it does not disappear, it lingers, reshaping perception long after the moment has passed, and as the lights softened and the next Performance prepared to begin. The grand hall no longer felt like a place defined solely by prestige and control, but something deeper, something more human, because it had been reminded, in the most unexpected way, that greatness does not need to announce itself to exist, and that respect, when it is truly earned, does not come from status or appearance, but from the quiet power of what a person chooses to do when no one expects anything at all. And on that night, without seeking it, without demanding it, Sister Margaret had given the room something far more lasting than a performance. She had given it a truth it would not soon forget, and in the stillness that followed, as the echoes of her music lingered in memory, the lesson settled quietly into place, that dignity is not something granted by others. It is something revealed through action, and once seen, it cannot be unseen.